I think most everyone here will know me, but I'm Elaine O'Neill, the Executive Director of the Washington Farm Forestry Association. So with that brief introduction, I'm really delighted today that we have two speakers from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, Keith Griswold and Misty Seabolt. And they have some new updates on two programs, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, and then the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. The way that this is set up, Keith Griswold will present the EQIP information first, and then we'll open it up for Q&A on EQIP. And then Misty will present the Conservation Stewardship Program, and it'll open it up for Q&A on the Conservation Stewardship Program. And of course, if you think about questions afterwards, then we can always do cleanup at the end. This was advertised, I noticed advertised for a couple of hours, but we really think we'll probably only take about an hour to go through all this. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Keith, and I think he's probably ready to go.
All right, thank you, Elaine. Good evening, everybody. I want to thank you, both Misty and I, allowing us to be here and present our information to you regarding the EQIP and the CSP program. As Elaine had stated, EQIP is an acronym for Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and CSP is the acronym for Conservation Stewardship Program. And we're going to explain the differences between the two. We've kind of tailored it towards forestry because we're trying to actually increase our forestry applications in both programs, but it's also available for anything, farm or forest land programs. So please feel free to ask questions when we get to the end about, what could this do for my grazing operation, or what could this do for my cropland operation. And that way you might get a flavor of what else is available if you haven't dealt with or participated with our EQIP program. So just to give you guys a heads up, I provided Donna the PDFs for these presentations. So if we miss something or you want to see it, the slides are available in a PDF so that you can go through it. But that way I figure if you get it home or if you want to review the recording again and you have questions, you'll be able to come back and ask either Misty or I what this means or what does this pertain to, or either contact your local conservation district office and talk with the district conservationist there. All right, so I'll jump in first. EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. This has been our flagship program since 1996 Farm Bill. We've been utilizing the EQIP program. It works with volunteer producers that have a resource concern on their property and they want to fix the resource concern. And so the EQIP program through NRCS provides not only funding to help assist you in installing the conservation practices, but we provide the technical expertise on the designs and the information on how to install the practices. And we're looking at basically protecting and restoring and enhancing your soil, water, air, and other natural resources on your land is what we're looking at. They are a contract. They are not a grant. If anybody ever tells you EQIP or CSP are a grant, no. As with a contract, all contracts have requirements. You're required to do something in order for the other part to do something. And in this case, through EQIP and CSP contracts, typically you install the conservation practice or the enhancement to our standards and specs. And then when it's done, we reimburse you a contractual rate that'll be in the contract that you'll see. If I install these many trees, I get this much per acre. If I install this much fence, I get this much per acre. The contracted payment rates are set each year. We're waiting for our payment rates to be published on the web, but that's what will be available for the contracting for this year. And you're going to see, I'm not going to read a lot from the slides. I provide that as additional information for you guys to be able to look at and utilize. Each farm bill, whenever you see FB, that's farm bill. Each farm bill has a payment limitation. And what that means is that within that allotted farm bill for these conservation programs, you have a set amount of funds that you can receive, and then you can't receive more than that. So in this case, for EQIP, under this current farm bill, the 2018 farm bill, we have a payment limitation of $450,000 per individual. If you are an entity, like you've got your family farm in a trust or in an entity name, the entity has a $450,000 payment limitation also. For all of our programs, EQIP, CSP, our easement programs, all of them, you have to be USDA eligible. And what that means is you have to go into the Farm Service Agency, and you have to, Farm Service Agency or FSA, they keep all of the records of all the lands for all of USDA programs, whether it's a loan or it's NRCS programs or it's FSA programs. FSA is the keeper of the data there for what is a farm and a tract. So, and a farm and a tract is just a number that's assigned to your operation so that they can track where the funds are going every time. These four forms here are the requirements for the eligibility. And so we have the AD 1026, which is the highly erodible lands or wetland conservation form. CCC 902, which is the farm operation, so that we know who can sign on behalf of either you or the entity. It shows who all the members are. Farm and tract eligibility, as I stated, that's where FSA assigns your property a farm number, and then if you have multiple pieces of property not connected together, then they give them different tract numbers. And then the 941, which is the adjusted gross income. If you make more, you or the entity make more than $900,000 in the last 3 running calendar years, you're not eligible for most USDA programs. So 900,000 is the typical limit that we look at for programs. So, like I said, we tailored this to forestry because we're trying to increase our forestry presence in programs. And so you're going to see a bunch of information here on forestry, but we have hundreds of conservation practices, depending on what your operation is and what resource concerns you have on your property in order to fix them. So in this case, I'm giving you an example of what all the practice standards we have for forestry through the EQIP program. So we've got forest stand management, and that would be pre-commercial thinning. I'm just going to give you ballparks of what definitions are for these practices so that you know what I'm talking about. Forest management plan. In order to participate in EQIP for forestry, you have to have a forest management plan. If you don't have one, we'll actually contract with you to hire a technical service provider to develop and make a plan, and then that plan can be used for your EQIP contract to install practices in order to solve resource concerns on your property. Tree and shrub establishment, that's pretty simple. You know, we're looking where we've got issues and where trees or shrubs could be established. Aquatic organism passage. And so you might think, what does that have to do with forestry? Well, a lot in Western Washington, a lot of the farms and forest operations have culverts that are hindrances to salmonid fish passage. And so we actually do a lot of work here on private lands in order to restore fish passage. So that too is an option available for your forestry. Fuel and fire breaks, pretty simple. You know, we're looking at putting up or cutting down trees, thinning them out, mulching and cleaning up the understory so that we can have a fire or a fuel break. And then tree and shrub pruning, once again, pretty simple. If you've got trees and you need to delimb them in order to get them cleaned up for activities, that's available there. So I want to give you guys an idea of how much funding we've got going on here in Washington through the EQIP and CSP program. So last year in fiscal year, that's what the acronym FY is, in fiscal year 21, we obligated 106 EQIP contracts that were forestry related for about $6.7 million. Out of our total allocation that we had for general EQIP of $17.4 million. So you can see it's running right up there in the 30-35% of our funds are going to forestry related activities. And so we're just trying to get the information out to people to see if you guys have any other forestry activities on your place, that you have resource concerns that you're interested in, and then get you connected with our local conservation district office with the district conservationist in it. Now, though, to give you an idea, our CSP program is not as well utilized in there. And so we only obligated 10 CSP forestry contracts statewide worth, I'm rounding up, $400,000 out of our total budget of $9.2 million. So the CSP program is underutilized, and right now, at least the last couple of years, we've been actually funding all eligible CSP forestry applications. And so we're looking to try and increase the quantity of forestry applications for the CSP program. And so that's a lot of the information that we're providing here. All right, for EQIP, that's pretty much it. That's the information that I had, but I'm welcome to answer any questions.
So if folks have questions, you can either unmute and ask a question, or you can type it in the chat as you're going. So one question that I don't think you did answer, Keith, is there a cost share element in this? You talk about a contract, but you didn't indicate whether or not we had to come up with 50% or 60%, or what is it, a one-to-one? What is our number there?
So we used to have cost share rates. We no longer have those. They're called payment rates now. And so we establish what we're willing to pay for the contract. So to give you an idea, say we're going to put in fence, 4-strand barbed wire fence. In the contract, we'd have it, and I don't know the payment rate number off the top of my head, but I'm just going to throw one out. We're going to pay $325 a foot, and you have to cover the rest. So to give you an idea, depending on where you get your supplies, depending on inflation has really messed everything up now. But prior to this, just a couple of years ago, we had people that would get anywhere from 50% of their project paid for, all the way up to 65 or 70%, because it just depended on where could you buy the supplies for the product. And if you installed it yourself, well, then that cost you less. I know your labor is worth something, but it cost you less. And so it might not come out that it cost you any bit of money. Quite a bit of our practices can be that way when you do them yourself to our standards and specifications. Then it usually costs you a lot less. But there is no set cost rate of we're going to cover 50%, as it's a contract. And in my example, I said we pay $325 a foot. If it costs you $4 a foot one year, and the next year it costs you $6 a foot, you as the contract holder are going to cover the rest of it. Our contract costs do not increase.
So there isn't a adjusted cost of inflation, because I've been looking at the prices of barbed wire, and field fencing's just practically doubled in your particular example.
Yeah, correct. And once the bad thing is once you lock it into a contract, that price that NRCS will reimburse you for is locked. There's no scale to go up with as prices go up.
So are these contracts for a year or 2 years?
They can be as long or as short as you want them to be. I would tell you the shorter the better. We have contracts that are 4 or 5 years that are EQIP contracts that are very complex, where we're putting in livestock watering systems where 1 year we'll develop a spring, and then the next year, and I'm speaking kind of like it was in a highland area where winters come and then you can't do much work on the ground for construction. But, you know, you put in a spring box and have the spring set up, and then we put in the pipelines to deliver the water to all the watering troughs, and then you put in the watering troughs and the fences in order to facilitate the livestock there. So those types of projects could take 3 or 4 years. The problem with having it that long, though, is there is no cost of inflation adjustment. So as the prices increase, the participant bears the burden of that.
Okay, there's a couple more questions here. One from Orv is, are sample contracts available so that they can be reviewed ahead of time so that you're not going cold into a contract? How does that process work?
So sample is not the best description. So I'll explain typically how it works is you would go in and you'd put in your application for the EQIP program. And one of our staff would come out and take a look at your resource concern that you have, and then they develop a conservation plan that goes along with the contract and figure out how many acres needs to be done with the forest stand improvement, and how many feet of fence needs to be done, and you know, figure out the logistics of the planning to make sure it fits your operation. There's no cookie cutter plan to go at it. Your operation is extremely diverse, and so we have to tailor our program to your property. And so as that goes through, once you are then we have a ranking process. We look at what resource concerns are being solved, and then the points associated to it. If you're in special resource areas, like we've got a air quality issue area in central Washington. So if you were converting from typical tillage to no-till, that would be a special area. So it has higher points due to the wind erosion that has occurred. So there's separate points all over the place, depending, and your application gets ranked. And then once it's ranked, we fund from the top down until we run out of money. So that's typically how it goes. When we get to the point where we tell you you're pre-approved for an EQIP contract, that's when you get to see the dollar value of what NRCS is willing to put into your contract. Now, you can go online and take a look at our payment rates and see and ballpark it, so that if you thought, oh, I've got this much fencing that needs to be done or this, you'd have a ballpark of what it's going to cost you and what the agency is going to pay. But typically, it's your draft number of the contract tends to come when we tell you you've been pre-approved because of your ranking score.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answered your question, Orv. There's another question here from Laura. It says, is there a conflict between the CSP contract and the FRAP program? Since Misty hasn't talked about CSP, I don't know if she meant EQIP and FRAP. The FRAP is Forest Riparian Easement Program that the DNR covers half of the value of fixing some of these culvert limitations. Usually there's a 10-year wait on that, etc. Is there an opportunity? I'm assuming you obviously can't double dip, but is there an opportunity there to apply for an EQIP contract instead of the FRAP program? I guess you may not know this, but
I actually do. You can't double dip with federal monies.
Well, yeah.
So
that's
if the state of Washington is willing to pay your other part, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, because oftentimes those particular programs, they're because there's a lack of funding at the state level, it can take 6, 8 or longer years to get paid.
Right.
So once you're in that program, you wouldn't actually be able to apply for the USDA program because that
it could take too long.
It could take too long. Okay.
Yeah.
There's another one from Paul and Judy Hansen, but it's on the CSP program. So we're going to wait until Misty presents on that. Yeah. And then there was a question about, does the fencing, you're thinking about fencing, does that include repairing old fencing? Would something like that be eligible?
So, yes. Yes, it is, with a caveat. So all of our conservation practices have what's called the lifespan practice on that. And so we would look at it and go, okay, we would ask you the question when we come out onto the field to your property, when did you install this fence? And, you might know, you might not know, depending on how long you've had the property. But we can also take a look at it and determine, okay, fencing for our contracts has a 15-year lifespan. So if your fence is over 15 years old and is in degraded condition and it is not functioning, then it could be eligible for an EQIP contract. That being said, though, it might not go back in the exact same location that you had it in. As I said earlier, we would take a look at your entire farming and ranching operation or forestry operation to figure out where it best suits your needs. And all of our conservation practices have standards and specifications, and so some of them can require that things get moved around. I'm not saying that that's going to happen every time, but we would look at it and go, okay, if we need to fence off the riparian area so that your riparian area can develop, then we've got the fence a certain feet away from the stream. So each one of these practices have standards and specifications and requirements in it, but you'll know what those are prior to signing the contract of what you're getting into.
Okay. And then a question here from Ken. What are the consequences of signing up and subsequently not being able to fulfill the contract for whatever reason? You think about somebody signs up for this contract and then they suffer a catastrophic illness or something like that. What happens then?
All right, I can answer the question because this is what I deal with mostly. If you have a catastrophic illness or a bankruptcy or any issue that's outside of your control, natural disaster, here's a classic one, and please don't take this wrong, but husband and wife sign up for the contract and the husband dies. And that was the typical person who would install the practices. When it comes to that, the participants can request a cancellation, and we cancel the contract without any penalties. So when it's death, bankruptcy, natural disasters, acts of God that occur, we tend to just cancel the contract with no penalties. And typically, I'll say that, typically, you get to keep the funds that you receive for the practices that were installed. Here's where it would not be that way. We require that systems be installed for certain practices. So as an example, I'll go back to the spring development, the pipeline, and the watering facilities. If you had a contract for those three and we installed the spring and we installed the pipeline and then the husband died, we'd either require the wife to install the watering facilities or pay back the cost share for the undeveloped system of the spring and the pipeline because they're not functioning to their design. So you can see where we kind of get put into a pickle. Every contract is different and every scenario is different. So I cannot give you a flat out, this is what we do, but I've given you a classic example of where we've had a spouse die, and typically we cancel the contract, and typically you can keep the remainder of the funds. All right. So those are things that are outside of your control that occur. If there are things within your control that occur, then we go after the termination, and termination has liquidated damages that are associated to it, and it's typically 10% of the total contract cost. So if you had a $10,000 contract with us, we can assign up to $1,000 in liquidated damages and cost recovery of the practices that were installed when we terminate a contract. So the bigger the contract, the higher the liquidated damages that could occur. And what typically happens with the termination is loss of control. If you lose control of the land, it is a requirement that you have that control of land. So if you sell a piece of property and it's part of the contract, and you don't ask us to, in the appendix, the rules for the program, it says that the participant has 60 days to inform NRCS of loss of control. If you don't inform us of that, we can go after termination. If you don't have control of the land and we make a payment on that land, that's an improper payment because you don't have control. And we would have to go and recover that, and we do that through termination. And I'll try and make it so everybody understands what they're getting into. You're dealing with a contract with the federal government, and I turn the bills over to the IRS. I don't collect them myself. So when things go south, that's when the IRS gets involved. So just, I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just trying to let you guys be informed of what you're getting into.
So in a case like that, Keith, a couple things that I'm thinking of here is, say it's like 3 years and you're going to do this, and you start by building the fences, and then the wildfire comes through and crispy fries them. Mm-hmm. Who pays then?
So that is an act of God, and we do one of two things depending on what you, the landowner, wants to do. We have in our EQIP program right now, in the last 3 years we've had a program called Wildfire Recovery. And anytime our previous practices that have been burnt up, you're not responsible to repay back those funds. But if you can afford to do it by yourself, you can rebuild the fence. If you can't afford to do it, then you can put in for an EQIP contract for a wildfire recovery, and we could assist you with rebuilding our contract to rebuild them again. So there's a lot of different avenues. Each one is different. If you had it under a contract, that is an act of God. It burnt up. You're not responsible for it to that degree.
And so here's another one, and then I've got a couple more little questions here, and then I think we'll move on to Misty. But so I'm thinking about that if you lose control of this, and I'm thinking about the example of you have a parent, maybe it's the last parent alive, they enter the contract and something happens. Now, obviously they've lost control, but they have heirs that may want to continue on whatever that practice is, like your example, your 3-year example.
Yeah.
How does that work? Because wouldn't it go into probate and everything be held there, or how does something like that happen?
Well, it all depends. If there's no will and it has to go through probate, then we're going to advise you to request cancellation. And actually, we can actually cancel it ourselves, because in that example where there was only one parent left and the contract was in the parent's name, when they die, we reserve the right to just cancel the contract completely if we can't get an error within 60 days. And anytime it goes through probate, you're probably gonna go past that 60 days. That's where a will, power of it, or not a power of attorney, but executor of the estate is extremely important. Then they can come in and they can sign for the deceased parent as is, and we can work through the contract, or we can just cancel the contract due to the death of the parent, and then it might be better off then for the heirs, once the probate or anything else like that is all taken care of, for them to come in and sign up for the EQIP program again.
Okay. The timing on these, there was a question here about timing, and somebody who had sort of a time-sensitive activity, and then they missed the weather on this, so they went ahead and did the activity without actually going through the process. I mean, the application was pending for over a year. What is the typical time window if people applied, say they applied now or in the next month? When would they know that they were approved?
All right, so I'm only going to speak for the EQIP program because the CS program has a different timeline. We had our EQIP application deadline was due in October 7th of 21. So for contracts for this year, that timeline has already come and gone. You could still put in your application now, but it'll be for next fiscal year's contracting. To give you an idea of when we typically contract, we try and get out our EQIP contracts by April or May of each year is our goal. So depending on when you apply, depending on how many applicants you're competing against, because you're competing statewide, you might put in an application and it be 2 or 3 years, because your project might score less than the others, and we always have to fund the top scores down. It's not first come, first serve. We are funding the most scored application or ranked applications.
Okay. So typically around the beginning of October, by then you'd better have your application in for the following year.
I would be turning in my application in August or September, or even now, so that you've got it set up for next year already.
Okay, so you're looking at 18 months advance. And then the last question before we move to Misty, do you have any examples of projects in Western Washington around salmon-bearing streams? So just kind of talk through what that might look like. I think
so I can give you a couple examples. So like we talked about previously, you know, if you had a culvert that was a stream or a fish impediment for fish to be able to go up, that would be one where we'd look at removing that culvert. They're usually a perched culvert. We'd remove it, and we put in a larger culvert that's sunk into the ground and typically has gravel that go through it. If it's a large stream or a river, then we can talk about bridges that are there. But those start to get very, very, very expensive. And you've got to come up with the other portion of it too. So they're not always the best project that's out there. Some of the other stuff that can be done in Western Washington along the streams, riparian forest buffers to install, livestock operations for fencing, watering facilities, off-stream watering facilities. If we needed to not put in a bridge and just do a hardened stream crossing for your livestock to be able to cross in a low area, those are all options. Small operations, we could talk about your cropping and your haying operations, and then there's always irrigation if you have a water right and you have an inefficient irrigation system. Say you have surface irrigation and you want to convert to sprinkler or drip, those are always an opportunity to go after also.
Okay, and there's one more here. What specifications are used to select EQIP projects.
What? That sounds like a ranking question. So each one, sorry, my earbuds are falling out, so I keep having to, all right, couldn't you? Nope, you can't hear me. Hold on.
I can hear you. I can hear you, Keith.
Oh, okay, good. It went dead on my end, so I was like, ah, crap. I pushed it in and it went mute. So for each ranking question or ranking pool looks at what practices you're going to install and the cost effectiveness of those practices. And then it also looks at the vulnerability of the soils that you have, and then what you're willing to do. So if you choose to as an example, if you choose to fence off the creek, but you don't want to put in a riparian forest buffer, and we say that there's a temperature issue here on this stream, then you won't get those points for the riparian forest buffer, and the stream temperature issue still hasn't been resolved. Whereas your neighbor or an applicant anywhere else in the state that's doing the exact same thing, if they're willing to address the temperature issue, they'll get a higher ranking points and increase the likelihood of their funding.
Great. That is great. Okay, let's move over to Misty, and the questions will just keep flowing if we keep answering them. So let's move over to Misty now.
All right. Hopefully, you guys should be able to see the screen, and this is a tag team of Misty and I on this one also, but she deals with the meat of the program here in the center, and I'm going to talk about just the overall of the program. All right, I want to make sure you guys can see the screen, correct? It looks like it.
I can see the screen. I can't see Misty.
All right, Misty, you're going to have to turn your camera on and turn your microphone on. All right, so both Misty and I, we work for NRCS. I'm the Assistant State Con for programs. I manage all the programs for NRCS, and Misty manages the CSP programs. And so she can answer the very in-depth questions that are available. So what are we going to talk about today with the CSP program? We're going to talk about what is CSP, who would be eligible for it, and how do you apply for it. All right, so CSP, where I'm going to back up a second. So where we had EQIP, and EQIP was the Fix-It program, and it's our flagship to solve resource concerns on your property. CSP takes it to the next level, and we're not fixing problems, we're enhancing the conservation benefits on your property. So it's no longer, I've got to fix this problem, it's, I want to increase the wildlife in my forestry area. I want to increase the diversity of the trees in my forestry area. I want to increase my livestock production through a rest and deferred rotational grazing system. So, like I said, you're going to see a bunch of information on here that pertains to forestry because we're trying to increase our forestry participation, but we've got it all for all farming types and operations that are available. Once again, it's a contract, it's not a grant. You'll know up front what you're going to be reimbursed in the contract practices. You'll know what the standards and specifications are and what you're required to do in order to get your payment. But you're taking your conservation on your ground to the next level. So CSP does not require a forest management plan in statute like EQIP does. However, a lot of the enhancements require that your forest management plan be updated to address these additional enhancements. So just remember that there is some strange caveats there that goes to it, but a forest management plan is always important for your forestry operations. So the enhancements that we're talking about go above and beyond our forest practice standards, where we're looking at increasing the level of conservation on your property. So they take that regular conservation practice that we've talked about and then take it one step further. And so, as an example, forest stand improvement, where we're looking at it, it would have so many stems per acre of the trees that you're looking for. You might be bringing in a different tree types if applicable, so it's not a monoculture stand. There's a whole different slug of different enhancements that are available, so I can't just focus on one. It's really a shopping list of what you want to do. And here's the big difference also between EQIP and CSP. In EQIP, we let you know what practices you can install to solve your resource concerns. In CSP, you're actually the driver of it, and you look through the list of the enhancements and you tell NRCS, okay, for my application, I'm willing to do this enhancement. This is what I want to do. It's no longer you're fixing it, you're making the choices of what you want to add to your property. And so in this case, the forest stand improvement also then looks at improving forest soil quality or carbon sequestration. So there's quite a few things that are being adopted when you take on these enhancements. And once, like I said, it's really a matter of you going through and looking at what all the enhancements mean. You can always ask questions, but then figuring out, I really want to do this on my property, whether it's increase soil health, increase aquatic species in your streams, increased wildlife in your property. There's all sorts of different avenues to be able to go with. Now, the key differences between EQIP and CSP is that if you're installing a conservation practice, EQIP has a higher payment rate. If you're going to install a conservation practice through CSP, it has a very low payment rate compared to the EQIP side because the programs are designed differently. Of a conservation practice, we are fixing a problem, and that is not what the CSP program is for. CSP program is for enhancements, and the adoption of the enhancements that you choose then come with a higher payment rate for you to adopt them. All right. And Misty, you're up next. Let me turn off my mic.
All right. Thank you all for having me. Good evening. So next we're going to talk about who is eligible for CSP. So there's 3 levels of eligibility that our planners will be looking at, and they'll keep you informed along the way. But there's applicant eligibility, land eligibility, and stewardship level eligibility. And we'll talk about each one of those. And just be aware the stewardship eligibility can be a little bit esoteric, and so it might be a little confusing. That's why the planners are there to help you walk through that, but we'll touch on that. Next slide, Keith. All right, so applicant eligibility. There are certain levels of eligibility for applicants that must be met. You must be an owner, operator, or other tenant, and that's legal language on the FSA documentation that we're looking for. You also must share a risk in the day-to-day operations of that land unit. So if you own that land unit with you and your sister who lives in Iowa, and your sister who lives in Iowa applies for the program, the likelihood of her applicant eligibility passing inspection is probably pretty low because she doesn't have the day-to-day operations within that program. This isn't super common on forest ground. This is something that we run into more often in cropland, but you can kind of see where we're wandering towards. The other thing you must have is control of the land. So if you own the land or operate in the land, but the owner's like, man, I don't want you touching the trees out there, you don't technically have effective control of that land. So you'd have to have a lease or something along those lines to show that you had control of the land. Now, we're probably not going to come and check your lease, but we're going to ask you, do you have a lease? And if we do any type of vegetative or structural practices on a land that is not owned by you, the owner will in fact have to sign off on that project. So just be aware there are technicalities that kind of hide within that applicant eligibility. And then in addition, if you've already had a CSP contract or you have a current CSP contract that is set to expire, you must be in compliance with that and any type of renewals that you have in your name or in the name of the entity. If you choose not to renew a contract or CSP contract, you can renew and renew and renew forever if you can make it work. But if you choose not to, then you go into what we call a 2-year cooling period. And that just means that you can't apply for CSP under that entity or individual name until the 2 years have passed. Next slide. You must have land eligibility. So all eligible land within the operation. This is different than EQIP, a lot different than EQIP. If you have 1,000 acres of land under John Smith, Inc., I'm just making that up, all 1,000 acres must be evaluated if it's crop, range, pasture, forest, associate ag, or farmstead. Forest is its own animal, so it gets to sit all by itself. So of that 1,000 acres, say 500 of it is forest, that is eligible for its own application and would not be required to be in the crop, range, pasture, associated ag, farmstead application. So all eligible land must be applied for CSP and assessed. Doesn't mean you have to enroll it in the contract. There are sneaky ways that we can work with that by exempting certain land uses, but all eligible land must be included in the application for the operation. And then land has to be crop, range, pasture, associated ag, farmstead. All public land, if there's documented control, is in one type of application, and then forestry is in its own application period. So forestry does not compete directly with crop and those types of applications. It is its own person or own animal. And then our last one. This one is the one that might be a little bit kind of hard to wrap your head around. Stewardship threshold. For CSP Classic, which is going to be what most people are going to apply for because they don't have a current CSP contract, our software spits out a report at the end, and it says, okay, of these 11 resource concerns that were assessed, you've met X, and you're going to exceed X by the end of the contract. So you've met this many at time of application, and you're going to meet or exceed this additional amount at the end of the contract. So when that report spits out on every person's operation that we input into the system, you must meet at least 2 resource concerns at time of application or contract offer, same thing, and then you must meet an additional resource concern by the end of the contract. So that is kind of hard to wrap your head around without seeing the actual documents in front of you. Once you had an application in place and we ran it through our CART system, that's our conservation, I don't even know what it stands for. CART, we call it CART. I know.
Conservation Assessment Ranking Tool.
There you go. That's what CART means. I know what CD means. That's Conservation Desktop. That's our mapping tool. So these two tools will talk to each other. We'll input all your land units in the Conservation Desktop tool, the mapping tool. We're going to put in all your application information. You've done these items. 666 or forest stand improvement was done on these 1,000 acres. We put all that into the system. And then at the end of the day, it spits out this report for us. Next slide. I think there's another one on this. Okay, and so within stewardship threshold, these items are taken into account. Practices already installed. So the system says, hey, on farm 9, track 7, field 1, has anything happened? And we say, yeah, absolutely. There's been thinning, slash treatment, and some pruning. We input all of the data on your entire operation that was applied for CSP into the system. So all your installed practices go into the system. Riparian buffer. Anything you can think of that has been done, it does not have to have been done by us. It can be done by the state. It could be done by a conservation district. You could have done it yourself. That includes any type of plantings, anything along those lines is inputted into the system. Then we input practices and enhancements that are planned. You can still do practices in CSP. They don't pay very well, but you can do them. So if you have a small area that needs a thinning, or a specialized thinning, it can be done. You would want to do some sort of cost-benefit ratio between EQIP and CSP to see if it's really going to work out for you. And then enhancements planned. And then your operational baseline data. You have this many stands, it's this type of forest, or this type of forest. Each one would be individualized, and that would run through the system. And you can see why having a forest management plan is pretty important, because if we don't have this information, it's really hard to gather it in the short time frame we have. So that's the stewardship threshold. And I understand that it can be kind of confusing, especially if you don't have the documents right in front of you. But if you move through the planning process or applied, you would be able to see these items prior to signing any type of contract. Next slide. Okay, so how do you apply? One more for me, please, Keith. All right, so we have CSP Classic is currently taking applications right now, and I can already hear the questions. Why would I apply for CSP if EQIP's right there? CSP has a flat annual payment rate that you're going to get paid for your contract, and no matter what your size of operation is, whether it be 2 acres or 100 acres, you at least will be receiving $1,500 a year, right? That is a minimum payment that everyone receives, no matter what. In CSP, you get a $1,500 a year payment. So if you have a micro farm, you're going to get $1,500. And then you can receive up to $200,000. And these annual payments are completed once a year in September, October, and then that's how you're paid for CSP. You're not paid as you go. You get paid once a year in an annual payment, and then that's it. So we have a current application period happening right now. So for any of you out there whose forest land is beautiful and perfect and you've done all kinds of work on it and it's ready to go to the next level, you could apply for CSP now, and that application period is running until March 31st of 2022. So that is happening right now. We have about 3.5 or a 4-month opening. We tried to get it in as early as we could to get as many applications as we could. The other thing is, like Keith had mentioned, CSP is very much landowner driven. So we have a CSP webpage where most of our information is posted. We're still working through the 2022 stuff as national rolls it out, but the enhancements and all those items are sitting on that webpage, and you'd be able to go through those. Generally, what would happen is if you applied and we started working through your system, our planners would say, hey, you have forest land. Here's all the forest land enhancements that are eligible for CSP. It doesn't mean any of the ones that you want to do, but they're going to say, go look at those on the website and see if any of those are of interest to you. And if you have a particular interest in butterfly habitat or maybe native species or edible species or something along those lines, you would be able to look at those enhancement sheets and say, hey, these ones really look interesting to me. And then that's how you would move forward with what's planned on your property. The application and the appendix have both been posted to the website, so you would want to pull one of those off and fill it out. Or what I would do for myself, because I like to have lots of information, you could call your local field office and have a talk with them about, okay, what's going on with applications? How would I apply? What would I be looking at? And what do I need to do next, kind of thing. So our local offices are available for that. Next slide, Keith. All right, and I'm going to say this again in the next slide, but the big thing that happens a lot is FSA records are not up to date. So you have to have your FSA records up to date for fiscal year 22, and those are the records. We're going to talk about them here in just a minute. And then you're going to want to visit your local field office to apply for funding. I tell people this a lot. The federal government is a lot like a cruise ship. It takes us a minute to get turned around in the harbor, but once we get moving, we move fairly quickly. So nothing's going to really happen too heavily on these applications until probably April, May, June, July is when you're going to see a lot of activity. That's when you're going to see whether you get pre-approved or if your application is going to be approved for funding. So fiscal year 22 application cutoff is 3/31 of 22. Your farm service records must be up to date prior to application cutoff. That means your 902 is in filed or determined status. That's important. In case you're wondering, those words are important. Your AGI must be filed. Your AD 1026, I believe that's your wetland compliance form, must be in filed status and must be in compliance on the FSA system. And your farm and track eligibility documentation must also be updated with FSA records. So what happens is FSA updates it on their end. In about 24 hours, that information filters across to our end, and we hit a button and everything should flip to yes, and our flags should all go away. If on 3/31, or I guess April Fool's Day, you have a no flag on your application, then your application would automatically go to ineligible because your FSA records were not up to date. FSA records are the participant's responsibility. Our planners will remind you, hey, get your FSA records updated, but we will not do it for you, mostly because we can't do it for you. It has to be done by the participant with FSA. And then lastly, get a hold of your local office. With COVID, I know that can be very challenging right now. Give them a call. Some offices are allowed to have face-to-face meetings. Some offices are not, but you can generally meet over the hood of a pickup outside in the field and have a conversation. So that's CSP in the fastest nutshell ever. And then I can answer any questions, or Keith can at this point.
There was a quick one. How do I update my FSA records? And then there's a more complicated one from Ken, and I'm going to make him ask it. So
you just got to get a hold of your local FSA office and talk with them about getting your records up to date for FY22. There'll be forms you have to sign, and I couldn't tell you what you have to sign or what needs to be signed, but there'll be forms you have to sign. And Ken, I see your question.
Hold it. So I had to turn my mute off so that I could just not be talking to myself. So typically, if you've already established yourself with FSA, the only form that you typically have to renew every year is the adjusted gross income, the AGI form. That is typically the only one that needs to be redone every year. Misty, it's yours.
That is correct. However, we did have some changes with the 902s for individuals within the last couple years.
Correct.
So previously, individuals did not have to have a 902 in filed or determined status. That has changed. And so that is new and special from FY21, I believe. So that might be something for individuals.
But once you file the 902, even for individuals, then it's there every year.
Right. It'll roll over. All right. And Ken, I see your question, and you are not alone in this situation. It is common to run out of items to do, particularly if you have a single land
you
use,
might, hey, Misty, read the question. Read the question, so if somebody's not looking at the chat, they can understand what the question is.
Okay, so I've been enrolled in CSP for 9 years and considering re-enrolling, but struggling to come up with meaningful enhancements that don't feel like make work because good forestry shouldn't have any resource concerns. I suggest one of the main reasons their low participation of forest owners in CSP is that unlike ag folks, their more intensive management forest is near perfect for all benefits to public and critter resources. I have understood CSP initially was simply for good stewardship, but it feels like it's becoming more about squeezing ever more out of perfection. My opinion, can we apply for just the base rate acres for stewardship without additional enhancements? No, on the last question, you cannot. In order to meet the stewardship threshold, you have to do something. You have to move that threshold from not met to met or met to exceeds. That means something has to be done. It is not uncommon to be running out of items at year 10 or after the second contract or even the third in some cases. I think we have just a few landowners who have been able to pull 3 contracts before they've run out of items to do. That is not crazy or outlandish. That is very common. The only thing you can do is wait for the next year's program because new enhancements are developed every single year and see if something else will fit the next time. But no, you cannot just apply for the base rate acreage stewardship. You have to do something additional on the land. CSP is paying for more intensive management. And like I said,
with every additional contract, you adopt more and more conservation.
Yes, and our crop people are having the same issue, especially with their second or third renewal. They've just run out of items to do, and they'll just have to wait until they can apply for Classic and get some new enhancements that are available to use. That's the only thing that we can do at this point, as the program stands now.